Hello and welcome back to Survey of Biology as we continue our Unit 12 discussion of the immune system. So if you remember back to 12.1, we talked about the first line of defense and how things like the skin and mucus and stomach acid try to prevent pathogens from getting into the body in the first place. Today we're going to kind of continue and we're going to look at the second line of defense. And so what happens once a pathogen gets into the body? And so we're going to look at things like the inflammation response, fever, the protein complement, and go through and look at the non-specific ways that the body will take care of pathogens that do make it into the body. So the big thing that I want to say right now is, just like the first line of defense, the second line of defense is also non-specific. It doesn't have antibodies. It's not going after a specific protein shape or virus or something. It's taking care of anything that's not self, anything that's foreign that gets into the body at this point. So the second line of defense, again, we said was non-specific. And the first response is called the inflammatory response. And this is the case where if you've ever had swelling, puffiness, redness, if any of you have hay fever or allergies, you know this all too well. And in the inflammatory response, following an injury or identification of a pathogen, there are these things called mast cells. And these mast cells release a chemical signal called histamine. And you may have heard of antihistamines, but the histamine basically calls phagocytes, calls white blood cells to the area saying, hey, there's damage here, we need to clean up things. It also causes the capillaries to become leaky, and so the white blood cells will ooze out, plasma will ooze out, and that's why the area may become swollen. There's more blood flow there, so there's more heat. It may become red and tender. So this is the inflammatory response that comes about when a pathogen enters the body. So if we look at this picture here and just kind of follow the numbers through, starting with number 1 up here. So when the skin is cut, a bacteria penetrates the wound, so a pathogen has gotten into the body. And number 2, the presence of that bacteria to local white blood cells called mast cells triggers a release of histamine granules surrounding the tissue. So here's the mast cells. They identify a pathogen right there, and they release these histamine granules. The histamine granules are chemicals that increase permeability to local blood vessels and stimulate other cells of immunity. So the capillaries literally become leaky, and plasma and the white blood cells that are in the blood will leak out, and they will go to the area of damage. So since local blood vessels are dilated from histamine, plasma flow to areas increased, causing redness, swelling, and pain. So these are the normal responses to an injury, and they let our body know that, hey, something happened, and we're working on it. And finally, 5, the white blood cells, called neutrophils, and we'll talk about those in just a minute, come to the site of infection from local blood vessels, engulf bacteria and damaged cells. We'll also talk about macrophages, so one of the leukocytes and their role in coming in and cleaning up bacteria. But the first response is the inflammatory response. So the second component of the second line of defense are the leukocytes, or the white blood cells, WBCs, and they're called phagocytic. And what that means is they're big eater cells. They'll come in and they will eat up the bacteria, the virus, dead cells, cells that are infected, and they are responsible for the ingestion of invading cells, or more rightly, that should be the ingestion of infected cells. And the phagocytic white blood cells consist of several different types. So the main kind are what we talked about in the previous slide, these cells called neutrophils. So they're 60 to 70% of the leukocytes, and they're attracted to the damaged cells. So they're called there by the histamine and the chemical messengers that are sent. There's also monocytes, and there's fewer of these, but these are the macrophages. So these are the ones that come in and will gobble up large areas. And then finally, there's natural killer cells, or NK cells. And they'll go and they take care of cells that have already been infected. So they'll take care of a body cell that has a virus in it or something like that. And again, all of these are non-specific. They're not going after a specific pathogen. They're just trying to take care of anything that gets into the body. And all these white blood cells, as they deal with this damage, they die as well. And sometimes if you've ever had an infection that gets pus on it, that's what pus is. It's kind of the dead and decaying white blood cells that have done their job. So here's a diagram real quick of the different types of white blood cells, and some that we haven't talked about. So the big ones that we talked about are the monocytes. So these ones are also known as the macrophages. So these are the big eater cells that will go in and gobble up cells. We talked about the neutrophils as well. So eosinophils and basophils we're not going to deal with in this discussion, but the lymphocytes we'll talk about in our next discussion when we talk about the specific immune response, and we'll talk about B cells and T cells and how they divide. But the white blood cells that you really need to be familiar with right now are the monocytes and the neutrophils. The third component of the second line of defense is this thing called the antimicrobial proteins, or the complement proteins. And this is what's known as the complement system. So we have these proteins that float through our bloodstream, and again, they're looking for things that are not self. They're looking for pathogens that aren't supposed to be there. So they will directly attack microbes, or they can impede the reproduction. They'll also go after cells that are already infected. And the way the complement proteins work is they will either identify, they'll bond to a pathogen that already has antibodies on it, or they'll go right in. So let's say there's a bacteria, the complement becomes activated and it will bind to the cells, and what it looks like is those proteins are used to make pores. So they form this ring structure in the cell membrane, which basically makes the cell leaky, and the cell can't keep its cytoplasm in, and it does what's called lysis. So the pathogen dies off because it kind of leaks out its cytoplasm and dies. So the complement proteins, again, are nonspecific, but they will try to attach to any pathogen they can, and they'll attack it. They'll form these pores in the cell membrane and lyse the cell so that it dies off. So those are the three ways: the inflammatory response, the white blood cells, and the complement proteins that the second line of defense relies on to keep us healthy. And we'll end this discussion, 12.2, with a picture. Here's a macrophage that's ingesting a pathogen. So they really do go right in, and they'll eat it up, digest it, and then get rid of the wastes. So thank you again for your time, and we'll talk to you soon.